Well, first I want to thank you for welcoming me to join you this morning. I work as a hospice chaplain, and when people hear that, they typically say, "Oh, that must be so depressing. How on earth could you do that?" Actually, it's the opposite of depressing. It's a very nurturing job. And there are many reasons for that, but two of them are. In many cases, I have the opportunity of speaking with people at a time in their lives when small talk and trivial things kind of fall away. And the conversations that people want to have then are frequently about the most important parts of life. Love, family, forgiveness, eternal life. They are deep and wonderful conversations. And also, selfishly, I gain so much spiritually from my interactions with the patients that I work with. And over the years, I've found unexpectedly that I also gain spiritual lessons from my patients who have Alzheimer's. We have a great many patients with Alzheimer's. Typically, it's not their terminal diagnosis. They may be actually dying from something else. But, excuse me, they are in many different phases of Alzheimer's. And that's what I want to talk about this morning. So I'm going to share several brief stories. And all but one are from my own personal experiences with people with Alzheimer's. One comes from a beautiful article from which I stole the title of this talk, Intimations of the Great Unlearning. And it's an article written by a theologian, Gisela Webb, whose mother had Alzheimer's. And she begins her article saying that, as a professor of theology, she finds that some of her most important spiritual lessons have come instead from being the daughter of someone with Alzheimer's. So the lessons I'm going to talk about this morning have to do with mindfulness and the importance of presence, compassionate speech and both giving and receiving compassion, and non-separation. So the first person whose life I want to share a little bit with you taught me about mindfulness. Many of you are probably familiar with mindfulness meditation. You hear a lot about that lately in terms of wellness, sometimes not even from any kind of spiritual perspective, but spiritually mindfulness means being present to the moment, present to whatever you're doing without cluttering your mind and your spirit with other things. So I had a patient, I'll call her Martha, who lived out in Core, beyond Core, up on the top of a ridge. And she had Alzheimer's. People with Alzheimer's frequently at various points in their illness live in a space without the boundaries of time and memory. There's only the present. And their present may be something that happened 30 years ago. It may not be the same present that we have, but to them there is only the present. There's no past, there's no future. So Martha had Alzheimer's. She always welcomed my visits, and she would always repeat things without remembering. I'm sure many of you have experienced that with people with Alzheimer's, but she would repeat things without remembering that she'd already said them. And we would visit first in her trailer where she lived, and then she always wanted to sit out with me on her front porch for a while afterwards. And from her front porch we could look out on just a beautiful view through the valley. And we would sit there for a long time, and she would say, "You hear those turkeys? They're down there by the river. Those are turkeys." And I'd say, "Oh, is that what they are?" She'd say yes, and a few minutes later she'd say, "Over there, that's a pear tree." I'd say, "Yes, that's beautiful." And we'd sit, and then she would say again, "You hear those turkeys down there? They're down by the river." "Yeah, is that what those are?" "Right. That's a pear tree over there." "Yes, it's beautiful." Over and over, every few minutes. And sometimes my mind would wander, and I would be thinking about my next patient or what I was going to make for dinner that night or anything. And she'd bring me back. Hear those turkeys down there? That's what those are down there by the river. Is that what those are? There's a pear tree over there. Over and over. And as I stopped letting my mind wander, I would find that I entered the present more deeply. I would hear things that I didn't otherwise hear besides the turkeys. I would see the blossoming trees that I hadn't really paid attention to, and I would enter into the present. It was like being with a spiritual master leading you on a guided meditation. So in those moments, as in many others, I came to provide spiritual counseling, but instead I received spiritual counseling. There's a Buddhist concept that some of you may be familiar with called compassionate speech or right speech. And what that means in the Buddhist tradition is speech that overcomes separation, or what's sometimes called duality. It's speech that bridges the distance between ourselves and another. So it's beyond what we normally think of as compassionate or kind speech. It moves into and accepts the reality of another person, and so it helps get rid of the separation between people. And I have many times experienced this with Alzheimer's patients. One that I'll share with you, I had a patient in one of the nursing homes, I'll call her Vivian, who would chatter a lot, but never made any sense. She would use sometimes it would just be nonsense words, other times there would be words, but they didn't really make sense, they didn't connect with anything. And she talked to herself, or she talked to me, she talked to whoever was around, but it just didn't make sense. And so a lot of people would just ignore her. But, there was one time, usually it was sort of pleasant chattering, but one day I went to visit her, and she was angry. She was just furious. And I couldn't tell what she was furious about. It seemed to have something to do with her clothes and some person who wanted her to do something she didn't want to do. That's as close as I could come, because she was looking around the corner for this person. And she went over, and she did that, and I'm not, and I said, no, I'm not, no. It was just all this, just fuming. And instead of trying to figure out what had happened and fix it, because there was just no way to do that, I sat there and I was directly in front of her, making eye contact, and with an open posture, and just listening. And I said reassuring kinds of things that I might have said if I did understand what was wrong. I had no idea what was wrong. But I would say things like, oh, I can understand why that bothered you, and you must be so frustrated, and oh, I can't believe she did that, and oh, that's so bad, oh, that's too bad. And as I did this, she gradually calmed down, and she breathed a little, and then she started talking again, and again it made no sense, but I swear she was saying something like, well, I guess she didn't really mean it, and maybe it wasn't that big a deal. You could just see that that's what she was trying to say. And finally, after a few minutes, she made a joke of some kind. I have no idea what it was, but she clearly made a joke and started laughing. And when I left, she was smiling. And it was just a perfect example, I think, of connecting with someone on an emotional level when the possibility of connecting with them on a logical level was just out the window. I couldn't even understand what was wrong, much less fix what was wrong. But entering her reality made her feel better. And another example of a very similar thing comes from this article that I mentioned to you. Gisela Webb, the author of that article, talked about compassionate speech, and she mentioned a moment when she was walking her mother up and down the hall. Her mother, at the end of her life, was in the Alzheimer's unit of a nursing home. And Gisela and her mother were walking. And at one point, a woman came up to her mother and put her arm on her shoulder and said, "Oh, Elizabeth, I was so sorry to hear that you were in the hospital. And after all the surgeries you've had to go through, I just want you to know I was thinking of you the whole time." And Gisela's mother said, "Oh, thank you. That's so nice of you." And they kept walking. Gisela's mother was not named Elizabeth. She had not been in the hospital. She had not had any surgeries. None of this was true. But both the woman who came up to her and Gisela understood and were expressing and receiving pure compassion. You know, it not only doesn't matter that none of this was true, it almost makes it more beautiful that this connection happened regardless of who these two people were. It was a very beautiful moment, and she talks about it that way. My father had Alzheimer's, and during a period in that progression when he had forgotten who we all were and didn't remember our names, I was visiting him and we went for a walk in his neighborhood, and a neighbor came up and talked to us, and my dad put his arm around me and said, "This is my sister, Marcella, she's visiting me." And the neighbor said, "Oh, it's nice to meet you." And it was the kind of moment that happens a lot with people with Alzheimer's, and it's frequently a very painful moment for families when the person who has Alzheimer's has forgotten their name and who they are. It's just wrenching. But in thinking about that moment a lot over time, it was actually a very lovely moment, because even though my father had reached the point where he did not know my name or quite who I was, he knew what was most important. He knew that he loved me. He knew that I loved him. He knew that we were deeply connected with each other. My Aunt Marcella, his sister, was his baby sister. He was very close to her, and he was always kind of the protector of her when she was little. So he felt that love and that connection and that importance when he introduced me as his sister Marcella. And so, again, what can be seen and felt as a sad moment is spiritually very beautiful, that he felt that connection even after so many other things were gone because of the Alzheimer's. That deep, intense connection was right there. And I had a patient who carried this connection even further. I'll call her Gloria, and she lived out at the Madison nursing home. And Gloria was a trained opera singer. She used to sing at weddings, and she used to sing professionally. She had an incredibly beautiful voice. And anytime you would come to see her, if you said something like, "Gloria, I haven't heard you sing in a while," she would start singing. And she would walk down the halls singing. It was just gorgeous. And her face at rest, I'm sure you've all noticed that everybody has sort of a resting face, the default face. Her face always was beaming with happiness, always, no matter what was going on. She was always happy. And she never knew who I was. I visited her a lot. She never had a clue who I was, and she never knew anybody was. But every single time I went to visit her, every single time anybody went to visit her, she would say, "Oh, I'm so happy you're here. I was just thinking about you. It's so wonderful for you to come and be with me. Oh, this makes me so happy." And she would stroke my face, and she would stroke my hands, and she would tell me how much she loved me. And it was never, "Oh, why don't you come more often?" And whenever I had to leave, she'd say, "Oh, this has just been the best day. You've made me so happy." She would say this every time to everybody. And one day, after she had done all this and told me how happy I made her and how much she loved me, she said, "You and I have always been so close. It's almost as if we started out from the same block of wood or something, and only later we became you and me." And that was such a beautiful image. I mean, don't we all come from the same block of wood? But we don't see that, right? Only later do we become you and me. So she not only had the ability to deeply love everybody, which of course we all want to do, and which is what Jesus tells us to do and what we all should do. She had it. She had it. And she also understood the connection that we all have. We all do come from the same block of wood. So I think about her a lot as I think about all of them. So mindfulness, presence, compassionate speech, non-separation, they're all there. Alzheimer's is painful. I don't mean in any way to minimize that. It strips away so much. But sometimes in the stripping away, it strips away things that usually get in the way. And it can just take your breath away to see that sometimes what's most important remains and becomes more clear. So I'm very grateful to my patients who have been and continue to be my teachers as well. And thank you for allowing me to share some of these glimpses with you this morning.